Hey everyone. Welcome back to Strange Mind 6. I'm your host Ruby, and today we're going to be reading more of Rebels and Revolutions, Real Tales of Radical Change in America by Judy Dodge Cummings. Before we begin, I would like to ask if you could please hit that like button and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. It would mean a great deal to me if you did. And without further ado, my dear friends, grab a snack, grab a drink, or sit back and relax. And let's get to it. 1. 1923, Sierra Madre, California. Yosh Kuromiya is born. 2. Fall, 1942, Wyoming. Yosh and his family are forced from their home to Heart Mountain Relocation Camp in spring 1944. Yosh refuses to report to the U.S. Army. Chapter 3. The Heart Mountain Resistors. The letter arrived in the morning mail on March 16, 1944. Yosh Kuromiya had been expecting this. The dread filled his stomach as he opened the envelope. Order to report for pre-induction physical examination. It was as Yosh had feared. He was being summoned. The world had been embroiled in the bloodbath of World War II since 1939. The United States was fighting Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific. Yosh was a healthy 21-year-old. He would certainly pass his physical, be inducted into the army, and sent to Europe to fight. Outside the dingy window of Yosh's quarters, row after row of army barracks squatted on the barren Wyoming plain. This garrison was surrounded by a barbed wire fence and guard towers. Beyond the fence loomed the snow-covered foothills of Heart Mountain. A chill settled on Yosh's heart. He had a terrible choice to make: obey the law and defend his country, or break the law and defend his principles. Yosh was a Nisei. This term refers to a person of Japanese ancestry living in the United States. Yosh's parents had been born in Japan. They joined the wave of Japanese people who immigrated to the west coast of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yosh's parents settled in Southern California. These first-generation Japanese immigrants, or Issei, faced much discrimination because they spoke a different language, were Buddhists, and looked different from whites. The newcomers were labeled the Yellow Peril. Laws were passed to prevent the Issei from becoming full members of American society. They were barred from becoming American citizens, forbidden to buy land, and not allowed to eat in certain restaurants. In 1924, the federal government cut off all further immigrations from Japan. But Yosh Kuromiya was a Nisei, the child of a Japanese immigrant. He had been born in the United States and was a citizen. The Nisei were as American as their white neighbors. The Nisei spoke English, joined the Scouts, studied the U.S. Constitution in school, listened to swing music, and played baseball. However, like their parents, the Nisei faced racial discrimination. One afternoon, Yosh was hanging out with some buddies at the house of a white friend. The boys had been climbing trees in the backyard and decided to go in the house. Just as Yosh was about to enter, someone slammed the door shut and locked it. Thinking it was a joke, he waited and waited. No one opened the door. Yosh realized what this meant. He was the only Japanese boy in the group, and he was not wanted. Nisei children were taught to ignore such insults. If a Nisei girl was not invited to a classmate's birthday party, her mother would say, "It can't be helped." If a teacher told a Nisei boy that he was forbidden from serving on the student council because of his race, the boy's father would advise him to just endure it. If a group of Nisei's youth got in trouble for walking through a white neighborhood, their parents would insist they never make that mistake again because the nail that sticks up gets hammered. Isn't that what we're facing nowadays? That's ridiculous. Most Issei raised their children with sayings that reflected Japanese principles. Avoid conflict and keep a low profile. That was considered the best way to assimilate into America. The Nisei who took these lessons to heart formed the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, in 1930. The JACL leaders were older, educated Nisei, the doctors, lawyers, and college professors. They worked to gain acceptance in the United States. The lower class, less educated Nisei, such as Yosh, thought the JACL was a stuck-up social club run by rich people who did not understand the concerns of poor Nisei. By 1940, the United States government considered JACL to be the voice of all Japanese Americans. Soon, that would be saying something Yosh did not want to hear. Sunday, December 7, 1941, dawned over the city of Honolulu on the island of Hawaii. The sun shone over the row of American battleships anchored in the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. A cluster of clouds clung to the mountain peaks in the center of the island, but the rest of the sky was sapphire blue. Waves slapped against the shore and seagulls squawked. The landscape was tranquil and beautiful. At 7:55 a.m., this peaceful world exploded. Out of nowhere, Japanese planes filled the sky, diving low over the battleship Roe and the nearby airfields. Sirens began to blare and American sailors raced to the deck, some still in their pajamas. As the men looked to the heavens, bombs began to fall. More than 350 Japanese aircraft blasted Pearl Harbor for almost 2 hours. 8 battleships were destroyed or damaged, and 11 other ships sunk. Almost 200 American airplanes were destroyed. The greatest tragedy of the day was human. A total of 2,335 American service people were killed, and more than 1,000 wounded. There were also more than 100 civilian casualties. With one swift blow, Japan pushed the United States into joining World War II. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States of America. America now had to fight a war on 2 fronts, Europe in the east and Japan in the west. The morning of the attack on Pearl Harbor, 19-year-old Yosh Kuramiya was working at his parents' produce stand in Southern California when his white customers told Yosh not to worry because everything would be all right. He was irked. Those attackers were Japanese from Japan, he called later. I'm an American. It bothered Yosh that people linked him to the enemy. That was just the beginning. In the days following Pearl Harbor, government agents swept through Japanese communities along the West Coast, arresting more than 1,300 Isie. Government propaganda posters and political cartoons depicted Japanese people as ape-like, sly, and barbaric. Reminds me of what they did before. Anyone with Japanese features was called Nip, Jap, or Yellow. As the Japanese military scored one victory after another in the Pacific, Americans on the West Coast panicked. They began to eye the Nisie with suspicion. The director of the FBI concluded that the Nisie did not represent any security threat, but racism can be stronger than reason. Politicians and journalists fanned the flames of public hysteria. People feared the Nisie might spy for Japan or commit sabotage. Lieutenant General John DeWitt, the head of the military command in the western states, believed all Nisie on the West Coast should be deported. In early 1942, he said, "The Japanese race is an enemy race." Although the Nisie were American citizens, DeWitt believed their racial strains were undiluted. Newspaper columnists agreed. One wrote, "Herd 'em up, pack 'em off. Let 'em be pinched, hurt, hungry, and dead up against it." The Nisie were Americans, but they looked like the enemy. Therefore, they were treated like the enemy. As the public outcry grew louder, the government cast a noose around the Nisie and slowly tightened it. President Roosevelt acted first. In February 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066. This rule authorized the U.S. War Department to identify military zones from which anyone could be excluded. A curfew came next. On March 24, 1942, General DeWitt ordered all Nisie living on the West Coast to be confined to their homes from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. as the sun stayed up later each day that spring. Yosh stood by his window and watched white neighbors go for an evening stroll or out with friends. He could not join them. The curfew was not only the beginning. At the end of March 1942, General DeWitt announced that the War Relocation Authority would deport all Nikie from California, Oregon, and Washington. They were ordered to prepare for relocation to a temporary residence elsewhere. Yosh wondered how long temporary would be and where elsewhere was. The JACL cooperated with War Relocation Authority officials to help the deportation go smoothly. No one talked of resisting the deportation. The JACL wanted to prove the Nisie were loyal Americans. Going along peacefully with the deportation would demonstrate their patriotism. Yosh Kuromiya's family had 2 weeks to put their affairs in order before they had to report to a temporary assembly center at the racetrack in Pomona, California. Yosh was an art student enrolled in a community college. He had to drop out. Ordered to bring only what they could carry, the Nisie raced to sell their houses and sell or store their cars, furniture, and other belongings. Farmers, such as Yosh's parents, were forced to leave their crops in the ground or to rot. Many Nisei families did not own vehicles, so they rode school buses to their assigned assembly center, but Yoshi's family had a pickup truck. Hoping to find a way around the luggage rule, they loaded the truck with most of valuable possessions and drove to the Pomona racetrack. The guard at the gate ordered the Kuramas to take only what they could carry from the back of the truck and leave the rest. For the next few days, Yosh could see their truck parked just beyond the fence. One day, it disappeared. He never saw the truck or their belongings again. When the Nisei entered the assembly center, they were each handed an empty cloth bag and ordered to fill it with straw. These bags served as their mattresses. Yoshi's family was housed in a long barrack that had been divided into 20 by 20-foot rooms. Each family lived in one room, bare except for a single light bulb and army cots. Gaps between the tops of the walls and ceilings meant there were no privacy, but the Karamiyas had it better than the deportees, who were housed in old horse stables. The walls and floor of those rooms were saturated with horse urine and covered with horse hair. More than 5,000 people had to share just 36 showers and toilets. Yosh endured a long, hot summer at the Pomona Assembly Center. Meanwhile, the War Relocated Authority hastily built 10 camps to house 110,000 Nisei for the long term. These concentration camps were located in California, Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, Colorado, and Arkansas. By the fall, the residents of Pomona were on the move again. As the train chugged through pine forests and up snow-topped mountains, Yosh could almost pretend he was going to summer camp. The Heart Mountain relocation camp was in Wyoming, a state he had never visited. So far, the scenery was beautiful, and images of canoe races and marshmallow roasts ran through his mind. Then the train descended to a desert as dry and barren as the moon. When Yosh saw the Heart Mountain relocation camp sprawled out before him, the fantasy evaporated. With barbed wire fencing, guard towers, searching lights, and military police, this was no summer camp. This was a prison. Yosh stepped off the train and into a dust storm. Gusts of winds stirred up sand into a blizzard that shot dirt up his nose and into his mouth and ears. He later described Heart Mountain Camp as a god-awful place. Rows of army barracks stood as if waiting inspection. Each barrack was 20 feet wide by 100 feet long and divided into 5 rooms. Yosh stared a 20 by 20-foot room with his parents and 2 sisters. The walls and floorboards were warped, allowing the wind and snow and bugs to creep in. Empty orange crates became shelving and stools. Each group of 12 barracks shared communal bathrooms and shower facilities, as well as a recreational room and mess hall, where a lot of barely edible rice was served. The Nisei tried to create a version of their old lives. The children attended classes, people planted gardens. The camp started its own newspaper, the Heart Mountain Sentinel. But as the months dragged on and the war showed no signs of ending, Yosh wondered if he would be imprisoned forever. In fact, the JACL was working to get some of the Nisei out of the camps. Mike Masakawa, the leader of the JACL, wanted the army to draft them. If Japanese American blood was spilled in defense of the country, no one could claim the Nisei were not loyal citizens. The problem was that after Pearl Harbor, the military had classified all Nisei as 4C, aliens not accepted to the armed forces. Masakawa fought this prohibition. Masakawa told the delegates gathered for a JACL conference, somewhere on the field of battle, in a baptism of blood, we must prove to all that we are ready and willing to die for the one country we pledge allegiance to. The JACL voted to petition the government to draft the Nisei. When the delegates returned to their camps, they were nervous. They had to tell these men behind barbed wires that they might get their freedom soon, if they were willing to die for it. President Roosevelt liked the idea of Japanese Americans fighting for their country. That winter, on February 1st, 1943, he announced the formation of the 442nd Regiment, an all-Nisei combat team. The government called for volunteers, hoping for at least 3,600, but there was one catch. The War Department refused to allow any Nisei into the Army until their loyalty was checked. On February 6, 1943, registrations teams were sent into the camps to sift the loyal Nisei from the disloyal, but instead of questioning just draft age men, the officials used a questionnaire to interrogate every adult in camp, male, female, Issei, and Nisei. It was a disaster. 2 questions proved to be the stumbling block. Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty whenever ordered? This was a trick question. If the Nisei answered no, would the government think they were disloyal? But if they answered yes, could they immediately be sent into combat? Question 28. Will you swear allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States and forswear any alliance to the Japanese Emperor? Question 28 stunned the Issei. They were forbidden by law from ever becoming American citizens. Now the United States was asking them to give up their Japanese citizenship. They would be a people without a country. This question was a slap to the face to the Nisei. They were American citizens who had never been loyal to the Japanese emperor. Why should they have to forswear an allegiance they never had? The registration was a failure. Fewer than 6% of the fighting age Nisei volunteered to join the 442nd Regiment. Worse, by the end of 1943, more than 9,000 people had asked the government to send them to Japan. Most of these requests were from the Nisei. Meanwhile, newspapers railed about the disloyal Japs. Congress held an investigation and decided to isolate the disloyal Nisei. In the fall of 1943, some 19,000 Niseis were transferred to Tule Lake, a camp for troublemakers in California. Back at Heart Mountain, loyal Nisei, who had no desire to move to Japan, felt angry and betrayed by the loyalty questionnaire. They had suffered through deportation, imprisonment, and interrogation, simply because of their race. These Nisei had done their best to follow their parents' advice and just endure it. In 1944, the government took another step, one that proved unendurable for many Heart Mountain men. On January 20th, 1944, the government announced the Nisei would be drafted. By early February, men at Heart Mountain began receiving notices telling them when a bus would arrive to take them to the city of Cheyenne for their pre-induction physicals. If they passed the medical exam, they were going to war. Yosh was worried and bitter. He might be sent to risk his life in war while his family remained locked up. That was not a principle he was willing to die for. A few weeks before the draft was announced, a man named Kiyoshi Okamoto had organized a group called the Fair Play Committee, FPC. This group held meetings in one of the mess halls to talk about how it could improve life in the camp. When word of the draft reached them in January 1944, the FPC members began to debate this issue. The evening of February 8th, 1944, the FPC held its first public meeting. About 60 men showed up to hear Kiyoshi Okamoto speak. He was not a lawyer, but Okamoto knew a lot about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He laid out a logical argument about why drafting men who had been denied their civil rights was against American values. Yosh attended the meeting. He was skeptical, so he sat in the back of the room in case he decided to sneak out. But Yosh wound up staying for the entire meeting and returned the next night too. Okamoto put to words the feelings that had been turning in Yosh ever since he heard about the draft. What the government was asking him was unjust. Yosh became a member of the FPC. There were 3 requirements for members. You had to be a Nisei, you had to be absolutely loyal to the United States, and you had to be willing to serve in the military once your civil rights had been restored. The FPC wanted to be clear. They were not traitors. They were loyal resistors. Interfering with the draft was a crime punishable by 5 years in jail and a $10,000 fine. The Heart Mountain Sentinel was the camp's newspaper controlled by members of the JACL. The paper printed articles that cast the leaders of the Fair Play Committee as clever troublemakers and deluded youth. The editor of the Heart Mountain Sentinel called on the FBI to arrest them. The FPC leaders stepped up their resistance. On March 4th, 1944, they circulated a letter throughout camp calling on Nisei to disobey the draft. In the letter, FPC leaders agreed that the Constitution must be defended because it guaranteed the freedom, liberty, justice, and protection of all people. But they continued, "Have we been given such freedom, such liberty, such justice, and such protection? No." In the letter, they insisted that if Nisei did not resist such injustices and discriminations immediately, the future of all minorities and the future of this democratic nation is in danger. They urged members not to report for their pre-draft physicals. FPC members listened. On March 6, 2 men refused to board the bus for Cheyenne to take their physicals. The next day, 3 more men refused, and so it went on. Day by day, the resistance grew. Yosh Kuromiya was ordered to report for his physical on March 23rd. He considered swallowing a bottle of soy sauce before the exam. He had heard soy sauce caused blood pressure to skyrocket, but Yosh decided that was the coward's way out. The time had come for him to submit or to fight. At the next meeting of the Fair Play Committee, one of the leaders asked who had a physical schedule soon. Yosh raised his hand. "What will you do?" the leader asked. Yosh felt a million eyes on him. The pressure was intense. If he went to war, the nation and most of the Nicaea community would hail him as a hero. If he refused, he would be prosecuted as a traitor and could go to jail. Ultimately, Yosh's conscience overrode his fear. "I will not be on that bus," he said. The room erupted in cheers, and Yosh slumped back on the bench. He knew he had passed the point of no return. Late in the afternoon of March 25th, several large black cars pulled up in front of Hart Mountain Barracks. Families wept as federal marshals led away sons, brothers, and husbands. The community was stunned, but the resistance did not dampen. A few days later, 25 more men refused to report for their physicals. The government had had enough. The two top leaders of the Fair Play Committee, Sam Horino and Kiyoshi Okamoto, were transferred to the segregation camp in Tull Lake. Another 7 FPC leaders were jailed and charged with conspiracy to counsel young men to evade the draft. By June 1944, 63 draft resistors, including Yosh Kuromiya, were behind bars in the Cheyenne jail awaiting trial on draft evasion. June 6, 1944 was D-Day. The American military landed an invasion force of 150,000 men on the northern coast of France to push the German army east. World War II was not over, but it was the beginning of the end. Not so for the Hart Mountain resistors. 1 week after D-Day, they went on trial. Yosh was relieved when the trial date finally arrived because conditions in the Cheyenne jail were unbearable. Built to house only 30 people, all 63 draft resistors were crammed inside. Mattresses lined the cell floors and were squeezed into corridors. Twice a day, guards shoved food between the cell bars. However, the meals were so awful that the men flushed most of the food down the toilet. The inmates had no visitors because their families remained locked up at Hart Mountain. They were not allowed to go outside and spent 24 hours a day caged up. On June 12, 1944, the trial of the Hart Mountain 63 began. It was the largest mass trial in Wyoming history. On the advice of their lawyer, the men had waived their right to a jury trial. Their fate was solely in the hands of Judge T. Blake Kennedy. He had a reputation as hard-working and was well respected by other members of the legal community. Yosh and the other resistors felt optimistic about their chances for acquittal. Excuse me. That hope evaporated on the first day of the trial, when Kennedy referred to the defendants as "you Jap boys." The trial ended on June 20th, 1944. All 63 men were found guilty of violating the draft and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Other trials followed that of the Hart Mountain 63. Although draft resistance was less organized at the other concentration camps, there were men at 8 camps who refused to report for their physicals. Ultimately, 315 Nisye included the 7 leaders of the Fair Play Committee were imprisoned for draft violations. Their sentence ranged from 2 to 5 years in federal prison. Only one judge defied the pattern of conviction in the Northern District of California. In the Northern District of California, Judge Louise Goodman presided over the trial of 27 men. Goodman said the government's decision to draft people it had unjustly locked up was shocking to the conscience. He dismissed the charges against all 27 men. The government did not appeal this verdict. The convicted Nisye were held in federal prisons in Kansas, Washington, and Arizona. In August 1945, while the resistors were still behind bars, the United States dropped atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities, one on Hiroshima and a second one on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, and World War II had ended. 2 days before Christmas of 1945, U.S. President Harry Truman pardoned all the Japanese American draft resistors. Finally, they were free to take their place as full citizens again. In a 1993 interview, Yosh Kuromiya was asked why he resisted the draft. He said he had no choice. As an American citizen, we all had an obligation to raise the issue of the incarceration and evacuation. When Yosh refused to submit to the draft, he did not know how severely he would be punished, but he was willing to take the risk. In Yosh's words, somebody had to say something. In 2000, the Japanese American Memorial to Patriotism during World War II was erected at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The memorial depicts cranes entangled in barbed wire, and the names of the Nisye soldiers who died in World War II are carved on the walls surrounding the monument. The words President Truman spoke to the Nisye soldiers when they returned from Europe are on display. You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won. Keep up that fight to make this great republic stand for just what the Constitution says, the welfare of all the people, all of the time. Missing from this monument are names of the Heart Mountain resistors and the rebels at the other camps who followed their consciences. And that is what's happening nowadays, isn't it? Mass deportation, prejudices, so much negativity to say, so much racism that's going on in this world. We have to be able to live amongst each other and to try and get along and actually understand one another. Not just go along with the racism because somebody says a couple of things and everyone thinks that it's correct. No, not everybody is like that. But, my dear friends, this has been Ruby, signing off, and may you all have a wonderful morning, noon, or night whenever this video reaches you.